Consider this before viewing cells. Have you ever cut or burned yourself? How did your skin look and feel as it healed? As you watch the program, think about how skin cell growth helps to repair a wound. Consider the potential for laboratory skin cell growth. What advantages or disadvantages might this new technology have for humans? Assignment Discovery now presents Cells.
Playing near water is dangerous enough, but when it's boiling hot, the results can be tragic. Michelle was less than a year old when she fell into a bath of hot water and had to be rushed to hospital. With burns over most of her arms and legs, doctors feared for her life. The usual way of treating a burn is to cut some skin from an unaffected part of the body and place it onto the wound to grow. But skin takes a long time to grow back, and the painful wounds need covering fast before infection sets in. So, Michelle's doctors decided to try out a new technique, growing skin in the laboratory. They start with a small sample of unaffected skin from the patient and cut it up into smaller pieces. Skin is made up of tiny building blocks called cells. Scrape a scalpel across the skin and some of the cells will rub off and fall into the surrounding liquid. To see them, you need to look through a microscope, which makes them look about 300 times bigger than they really are. Each round blob is a single cell. The cells are placed into a flask of nutritious pink liquid, which helps keep the cells alive and provides them with food and water for them to grow. Every few hours, cells divide. They don't get bigger, they simply grow in number. As they divide, they eventually cover the bottom of the jar. After 3 or 4 weeks, the cells have multiplied to form a thin layer of skin. What was once just a few individual cells has grown into a large sheet, but it's fragile and very flimsy. To make it easier to handle, this almost invisible sheet is clipped onto a piece of surgical dressing. A small sample of skin can be grown to produce about 50 of these sheets, which is enough to cover the burns on Michelle's legs.
Thanks.
After several months, Michelle's new skin is looking better. The new technique has proved a success, and by growing skin quickly in this way, it's helped save her life. Each small patch of skin grown in the laboratory was made up of about 2 million cells. So how many skin cells do you think are covering your body? These are microscopic animals and plants. Rather than being made of many cells, they simply exist as single cells on their own. These images have been magnified hundreds of times. The single cells are so small that you can't normally see them. It was only with the invention of the microscope, just over 300 years ago, that creatures like this became visible. Before then, no one knew that cells existed.
You know, the closer you look at things, the more amazing they seem to get. If I hold this piece of cork in my hand, it has definite shape, feel, I can see the colour, but put it under my new microscope and... oh, well, I've never seen anything like it in my life. This is Robert Hooke. It's 1665, and microscopes have only just been invented. For the first time, scientists were able to look at things too small to be seen by the naked eye, and Robert Hooke was fascinated by what he saw. Oh. This piece of cork seems to be made up of tiny compartments, like lots of little rooms all fitted together. Rooms or cells. Yes, they look like cells. Hooke became famous for being the first person to use the word cell to describe the room-like structures inside his piece of cork. He spent many hours carefully drawing their honeycomb pattern. Although Hooke gave cells their name, nobody knew what they were or even what they did. To find out more about cells, scientists had to be able to see in more detail. But the early microscopes of the 1600s just weren't good enough. It was 150 years before better lenses were crafted and a clearer picture became possible. In 1833, one of the leading botanists of the time was Scotsman Robert Brown. Having travelled the world and collected hundreds of plants, he made a startling discovery. There are so many plants, all of them so different, except when I look at them close up. Every plant is made up of cells, and inside every cell there is a sort of dark, dense blob. Whichever plant I choose, it's always the same. I can find not one single exception. Robert Brown called the blob-like structure inside each cell the nucleus. About this time, scientists were beginning to realise that all living things were made of cells. A few years later, in 1839, two German scientists, Dr. Schwann and Dr. Schleiden, came up with a theory which was to change the way scientists viewed the living world. Dr. Schwann? Yeah, Dr. Schleiden. That's them. I think we have discovered something completely amazing. The material inside the cell moves about. Very slowly, I grant you, but still, she moves. We can only conclude one thing from this. You mean? Yeah, the cells are alive. Oh. This got me thinking. Sometimes a single cell exists on its own. But more complex creatures like you or I are made up of millions of living cells, all working together. All living things are made of cells, no matter how big or small, like a plant. Even this fly. Yeah. And the theory they eventually came up with was that cells are the basic building blocks of life. From then on, science has never looked back. As better microscopes have been developed, our view of the world has changed, and scientists have been able to look at small things in more and more detail.
This pinhead has been magnified by a modern electron microscope. Instead of making the pin hundreds of times bigger, it magnifies it thousands of times. At an even greater magnification, the speckles on the pin can be seen to be tiny bacteria, very simple single cells. An amoeba is one of the simplest living creatures. This single cell is able to make food, to grow and to reproduce, all on its own. It's completely self-sufficient. Humans and larger animals are much more complicated. We are made up of many millions of cells. A typical animal cell is like a tiny blob of jelly. Take a look inside, and there's a nucleus surrounded by a jelly-like substance called cytoplasm. The outer covering is called the cell membrane. The cell membrane acts a bit like a barrier, controlling what passes in and out. Only certain substances like food and raw materials are allowed in. Waste and other chemicals pass out. The nucleus is the control center of the cell. It dishes out instructions to other parts of the cell and contains all the information for making new ones. The cytoplasm is a jelly-like substance inside the cell membrane. It's here that all the chemical reactions which keep the cell alive take place. As time goes by, part of the cell might need repairing. When this happens, the nucleus sends out information for new growth. Food which enters the cell is used in a series of chemical reactions. And hey presto, a new part of the cell is made. The old part of the cell is removed and quickly replaced. Each cell is alive, moving, growing, repairing itself until it gets too old, and then the whole cell is replaced with a new one. Human cells come in all shapes and sizes. Some have specific jobs to do. The surface of the tube into your lungs is kept moist with mucus. Bacteria and dust stick to it. To stop these unwanted substances from entering your lungs, the cells on these surfaces have tiny microscopic hairs which wave around and push the mucus up to your throat. These are blood cells. They're filled with a red pigment which carries oxygen. And this is a nerve cell. But why is it this peculiar elongated shape? Some of the largest plants on Earth are the giant sequoia trees. They've been growing on the west coast of America for hundreds of years. Like all plants, they're made of cells, millions of them, all joined together. Some of the smallest plants on Earth are microscopic algae. These can be only a few cells small. But there's a whole host of plant life in between. Walk through any park or woodland and you'll see plenty of variety. But there are some plants that are not so pretty. To you or I, nettles are a stinging plant to be avoided at all costs, an unwanted weed. But they're more useful than you might think. Because nettles have tough stalks, they can be used to make clothes. Peel off the outer bark of the stem, and underneath there's a mass of stringy fibres. It's these long hair-like fibres which can be spun into a thread and used to make fabric. Each fibre is made of just a few cells. So what is it that makes them so strong? Typical plant cells have a box-like shape. Just like animal cells, they have a nucleus and a cell membrane. But plant cells also have a cell wall. It's a rigid outer covering made of a strong material called cellulose. It's the thick cell walls in the nettle fibres that make them so strong and useful. The fibre is tough and difficult to work with, but once you have enough of it, combing out any remaining bits of bark make it easier to spin into a thread. The fibres are gently twisted between the fingers and spun into a yarn, ready to be woven into cloth. Who Who would have thought that what was once a bunch of stinging nettles could be turned into something you can wear? Thanks to their tough cell walls, nettle fibres don't break easily. So these plant cells allow all kinds of clothes to be made. Putting nettle clothing next to your skin won't sting, but will it catch on? While some crops are grown for the fibres in the stems, most are grown to be eaten. Plants are unique. They're able to capture the sun's energy and convert it into food. Each green leaf of a plant is like a mini factory. Its raw materials are water and carbon dioxide. Water travels from the roots, up through the stem, and eventually to the leaves. Carbon dioxide passes through tiny holes in the surface. A chemical reaction with sunlight converts the water and carbon dioxide into sugars. This happens inside the cells of each leaf. These green blobs are called chloroplasts. They act a bit like solar panels, harnessing the sun's energy to make the reactions possible. Leaf cells contain many chloroplasts, which is what makes them look so green. So why are root cells colourless? Roots normally grow deep underground. They don't contain green chloroplasts because they don't normally see the light of day. Instead, root cells are specially designed to be good at taking in water. These cells grow hairs to increase their surface area. Cells in different parts of the plant are designed to do different jobs.
Okay, yous guys. I'm here to tell you about our latest underground operation, so listen up. I called you here because we got an emergency on our hands. It's a matter of life or death. The boss says this plant of ours needs water, fast. There's only one thing for it. I need root cells to go in search of new water supplies. But it's gotta be the right cell for the job. So I'm looking for a cell with credentials. Okay, Sunshine, you's first. Hey, an underground job ain't for you. You need to be out in the sun, soaking up all those rays and keeping those chloroplasts of yours hefty. What about you, tough guy? With a strong cell wall like that, there's no way you'll be absorbing any water. A stem is definitely more your style. Hey, we got an imposter here. Animal, what do you think you're doing here? This is a job for plant cells only. Now, what was I telling you? I'm looking for a root cell. A long, thin root cell to go in search of water. Ah, this is hopeless. There just ain't nobody long enough for an underground job these days. What? Hey, what's going on? Now, that's more like it.
Next, find out more about cells in a preview of Friday's show, The Ultimate Guide, Human Body.
The brain is able to adapt and learn new skills because, unlike the hardware inside a computer, the brain is not set in stone. It is of an almost fluid nature. Humans are made up of about 70 million cells. Boyce Ransberger, science writer turned biologist, has become obsessed with investigating the wonders of the cell.
The entire human body is made out of cells or the things that cells have made, such as bone. Skin is made of cells, your heart is made of cells, the muscles that operate the body so that you can move, these things are all made of cells. including the brain itself, which sends electrical signals around from one cell to the other so that we can think. All these different kinds of cells work fundamentally the same way. When you look inside the cell, you see the same kinds of structures.
Inside a single cell, there are hundreds of microscopic power stations, protein factories, recycling plants, and transport highways. The nucleus is the control center of the cell. It contains DNA, the blueprint of life that tells a cell how to assemble its infrastructure. The outer wall of the cell allows it to take in the raw materials it needs to stay alive. Cells trap these materials from the outside and package them into tiny cargo bubbles called vesicles. The bubble hitches a ride on a motor no bigger than a molecule, which latches on to one of the miniature monorail tracks that form the cell's transport network. Usually, the bubbles reach their destinations within seconds. But in the biggest cells, which stretch from the spine to the toe, the journey can take 4 days. Each bubble carries a code, a chemical address label that guides it to a particular location. When it reaches its target, perhaps a lysosome, one of the cell's many recycling plants, it hops off the track and empties its cargo. The job of the recycling plant is to break down the delivered raw materials into smaller building blocks, which the cell uses to grow. It seems that cells really are the fundamental building blocks of life. If so, what more can scientists learn about life by studying cells?
Everything we've looked at turns out to be explainable and understandable in terms of chemistry and physics. So the next question is, what about consciousness? You know, this seems like such a mysterious thing. Can it be explained through entirely natural processes? Most scientists say yes, of course it can. It's undoubtedly going to be one of the last frontiers in the study of how life works at the most fundamental level. And we may get close to it, we may never get close to it.
Could it be that our incredible bodies are no more than the result of physics and chemistry? Even if one day our very thoughts could be explained in terms of cells and molecules, there is something that lies beyond the realm of science. Quite simply, how we live our lives. Our experiences and memories really make us who we are. Unique inhabitants of nature's most complex machine, the human body.
Keep watching. Discussion questions and activity and resources for cells are up next on Assignment Discovery. Now that you've seen cells, talk about this. Over 300 years ago, Robert Hooke built his own microscope and discovered the cellular world. Discuss the history of cell biology. Develop a list of the most significant contributions to the study of cells. Then, debate the scientific and social implications of each of your choices. Now try this. Using only food items, create a 3D model of a cell. Consider the structure, composition, and purpose of the cell. Think about size, shape, and thickness of walls. Before eating, be sure to explain the design of your cell to the class. Log on to discoveryschool.com/teachers for curriculum materials and resources to support cells. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests The Life of a Cell by Andres Llamas Ruiz.